Hello, I'm Alec Avdakov, and welcome to the life and times of Frederick the Great.
So, for the 50th episode, as a thank you for sticking with me for so long, I wanted to make this a Q&A episode where it's more free-flowing and just my personal thoughts on the questions. So you won't get the regular podcast voice that you're used to hearing, probably. So, for the first question, this was originally from Patreon. In your eyes, what is the current state of the historiography of 18th century Prussia? What has it gotten right and wrong? And what, if any, improvements can be made to the scholarship? Now, this is a great question that I'm going to have to break into a couple of parts. So, first part, what is the current state of the historiography of 18th century Prussia? I would say that, as with most historiography in recent times, it's improving. It has gotten many of the myths that has long since gathered weight from the German nationalistic 19th century historiography. It's gotten rid of that for the most part in any sort of a modern history book that you see, except for on occasion David Fraser's book. He sort of has a triumphalistic view of Frederick the Great. But nonetheless, 18th century Prussia, I'd say as a whole, it's very obscure. It's not what many would go for in historiography. Again, it's dominated, particularly by World War II. As I will think it will be for the next who knows how long. But 18th century Prussia, as far as its own microcosm, I'd say it's improving. What has it gotten right and wrong? Well, you'd have to look throughout the historiography as a whole. The Nazi view that Frederick is the precursor of Hitler and that whole aspect, yeah, that's one of the huge things that's gotten wrong. But as far as it's gotten right, well, there's countless things. Historiography as a whole is just the study of how history has been written. So it's a constantly changing battle. It's when we gain new evidence, we have new interpretations, we have different views, yada yada yada. So one aspect that I think is definitely underlooked, especially with 18th century Prussia, is what it is in the popular memory. Non-existent. There truly is no popular memory of Prussia. That is one of the reasons I created this thing in the first place, but as a whole, it's fringe. It's very fringe. And for the most part, it's dominated by either nationalistic concerns or sheer myths that Prussia was this great disciplinistic society that would only be top down, and Frederick the Great could, with the palm of his hand, move the entire nation. Whereas this is entirely false. In this popular memory, it's only myths. It's not fact-driven, and it's one of the reasons why I created this podcast, to shed light on a topic that is mythologized, needs enlightening. And now for question number 2. Who do you think was Frederick's best officer? Secondly, what's your favorite Frederick battle and why? So, first question, who do you think Frederick's best officer was? There's a lot to unpack on that question, because I don't think there's a true definitive answer to that. Frederick's reign was 46 years, so there were a lot of different circumstances from the beginning to his end. And also, different people were used for different things. But as far as most consistently good and is able to have independent command, I'd say Field Marshal Schwerin. Yeah, Schwerin. He saved Frederick in the Battle of Mollwitz, and throughout his time serving Frederick, he continued to be solid as a stone. He just continued to seek victory after victory, and it was a grave loss when he died in the 7 Years' War. As far as cavalry officer, I have a soft spot for Zieten, for Hans-Joachim von Zieten. He was always an interesting character for me because he was sent to the Hussars because he was this wiry, short little guy that the infantry would have no need for because they all like the tall people. And he was just this drunken guy who would just yell non-stop at either his superior officers or the people under him. And until the Silesian War, he didn't sober up. He only sobered up in the Silesian War, First Silesian War, and became the nucleus for the Prussian cavalry, making it one of the best in Europe, if not the best, but probably not the best. One of the best drilled, and used it at great successes, especially at Torgau. And, well, as a shameless personal plug, I think at the beginning of his reign, Frederick definitely underutilized Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Dessau. The old Dessauer, legacy term-wise, he probably was Frederick's greatest officer. He did well in independent command, he had a wealth of experience, yet Frederick did not use him until 1745 in great effect at the Battle of Kesselsdorf, which there is a special episode on Patreon if you all are interested in donating and getting a glimpse at that episode. And secondly, what is your favorite Frederick battle and why? The Battle of Kunersdorf. This is a very big spoiler ahead, but Battle of Kunersdorf, for those of you who know, it was Frederick's worst defeat. It led him almost to suicide, and it's one of the most dramatic battles that he was ever a part of. He had 3 horses, I believe, shot under him, maybe 2, but either way, to have multiple horses shot underneath you and have different musket ball holes throughout his coat, it was the battle that almost shattered Prussia. It almost reverted back to Brandenburg after this, if the Allies had only followed up. But this also goes to show that Frederick's idea of the military doctrine that he had before the war was false. The idea that shouldered musket soldiers could simply walk up and with disciplined ranks fire a single volley and then defeat their enemy. It's bonkers now to think. It requires firepower, and the Austrians and Russians showed Frederick on the Battle of Kunersdorf that firepower would forever make a key role in battles. And now let's give it up for question number 3. Do you think Frederick was better as a tactician or a strategist? So let's define tactics and strategy first. So I got this definition off of a business website, but for our purposes, it's basically the same thing in the military context. So strategy is the action plan that takes you where you want to go versus tactics that are the individual steps that take you to get there. So in a military context, strategy would be the overall plan to make your state have advantages over the other state militarily, whereas the tactics are the individual steps you take to defeat your enemy. And in my view, in at least the early part of his reign, what we've discussed from 1748 to 1745, Frederick so far has been saved by tactics. His strategy has been subpar at best, but the tactics of his army has saved him. And this is fully broadcasted in the Battle of Mollwitz, right? So at Mollwitz, his right flank, his right cavalry, absolutely disintegrates. And he is forced to leave the battlefield. But when Field Marshal Schwerin took over, he reordered the lines, and eventually Mollwitz became a victory for the Prussian army. But that was tactics saving him from a strategic blunder in which he would have been defeated and made a laughingstock because, let's face it, invading Silesia in the winter against one of the greatest dynasties of all time historically is very impetuous. It's a very high risk, high reward sort of thing. And something that he thought would only take about 6 months or so. It would eventually become the obsession of the Habsburg crown for nearly his entire reign. But I won't go too far to spoil the strategic mistakes he'll make in 1756, but we shall see them.
And now for the fourth question. I love to hear about religious issues in Frederick's Prussia, and how he managed between his own skepticism and the importance of Protestantism in Prussia, and if the country was really more tolerant during his reign. So in one of Frederick's first pronouncements on religious policy was in 1740 when he first became king. He said, quote, "All religions must be tolerated, and the official's only task is to make sure that no religion interferes with another. For here, everyone must be allowed to salvation in any way they choose." And also, he said, quote, "If the Turks and heathens came here and wished to populate the land, we would build mosques and places of worship for them." However, he was more so talk than action in this aspect. Among Christian subjects, he was fairly good with being tolerant, and especially in Silesia, where there was more of a Catholic majority compared to the Protestant minority. He left Catholics alone and didn't put the majority of Protestants in places of power, even though there was calls for them to take power. But among Jews in the Jewish population within his realm, Frederick was a lot more harsh. He would force them to buy porcelain, even though there's no good reason they should. And in one monstrous quote, Frederick said in 1768 in his political testament, quote, "There are too many Jews in the towns. They are needed in the towns close to Poland because only Jews are involved in commerce there. But the further one gets away from the frontier, the more damaging they become. They are engaged in usury, smuggling, and 1,000 kinds of mischief to the detriments of Christian merchants." However, there was one very important Jewish philosopher named Mendelssohn, who would eventually have children, the famous composers Mendelssohn. But anyway, he would be one of the biggest proponents of German Jewish emancipation. And he was the archetypical rags to riches Jewish story that they were able to rise from humble beginnings to become members of a society. However, Jewish people in Prussia were not considered citizens. They were considered a population that the king tolerates to some extent. Now, it's for Christian subjects, yes, there was a high amount of tolerance, but for the Jewish population, not so much. Question the 5th. Who were Frederick's brothers and sisters? We really only hear about Henry and Wilhelmina. Well, here's a list of Frederick's siblings that survived into adulthood from the oldest to youngest. We have Wilhelmina, Friederike Luise, Philippine Charlotte, Sophie, Ulrike, August Wilhelm, Anna Amelia, Henry, and Ferdinand. So to say that Frederick Wilhelm and Sophia Dorothea, Frederick's parents, were busy is a bit of an understatement. One of the reasons we don't hear too much about other siblings is that there are just so many of them. There will definitely be episodes dedicated to Frederick's family matters, but here are a few notables of that massive group. Ulrika, one of Frederick's younger sisters, married the King of Sweden. August Ferdinand, the second oldest male sibling, would eventually get into a spat with Frederick during the 7 Years' War and would die at only 35 years old. Most books I have read attribute his death to Frederick being so hard on him and Ferdinand dying of a broken heart. Take that with a couple of spoonfuls of salt, however. Princess Philippine Charlotte became a famous composer and intellectual, and the youngest, Ferdinand, was a military commander and lived all the way until 1813 during the War of the Fifth Coalition for all you Napoleonic history fans. In short, there's just so much going on in that family that we can only focus on a few of them without going into the weeds. And now for good old question number 6. Who would win in a battle with an equal amount of troops, Frederick or Napoleon? This is by my colleague from Generals in Napoleon. That's a great podcast. You guys should listen to it if you like my stuff. So, here's how I would put this. The probability of Frederick defeating Napoleon in a one-on-one battle and just an empty field where there's no advantage either way, it's like 10% compared to Napoleon. Just because, one, did not have an organization of Jaegers or sharpshooters, so Napoleon would have scout advantage. Napoleon also lived off the land, so there was more likely to be some sort of a maneuver battle that Frederick could not compete against. So, in all actuality, sadly, it would probably be a thrashing of Napoleon against Frederick. But if Frederick was somehow able to have the perfect set of circumstances, say he ambushed Napoleon on a road and was able to roll up Napoleon's flank with his famous grenadiers, sure, it could happen. It's just, it has to be that set of circumstances on the battlefield, because history does not take place in a vacuum. There's no sort of 1v1 equal numbers perfect battlefield formation. That's just how it would go. So, that's my thoughts on the matter. I'd love to hear from you all what you would think. And the final question from my mom, actually. So, she asked me, why did you start the podcast? And I don't think I ever told you guys the full story. The full story behind why I started the Life and Times of Frederick the Great is a little bit of a funny one. So, one, obviously, I wanted to gain light on a subject that has been shrouded in darkness in the American zeitgeist for forever, I think. Maybe early colonial days, since there's a town in Maryland, I do believe, called King of Prussia, in honor of Frederick the Great. But beyond that, there's not been a concerted American knowledge of mid-18th century Prussia, pretty much ever. So I wanted to make that history into a digestible form that the average listener can listen to. 2, I found a book by David Fraser in an old bookstore. Very, very huge bookstore. John King has 4 rooms of books in a former glove factory. Really interesting place. If you're ever in Detroit, you should check out John King's books. Not sponsored by him, but either way, I love that area. So I found that book. I started to get inspired by the life, because there's just so much going on, and the more I read, the more I found interesting, the more I wanted to talk about it. But there's also a third aspect that I haven't really told anybody. So that summer, the summer of 2021, I was at my parents' house, and I thought, what is a way I can get out of chores? My dad likes to give me chores, and I don't want to move around that, outflank it, as it were. So I chose, being a podcaster, writing all these stories, taking all this time recording. This could be a great way to get out of chores. And it worked. It genuinely worked. This being the 50th episode, I am going to have to get a little bit sappy. I just want to tell you all, from anybody who has listened at any point in time, thank you. This project of mine has been a gift of passion that I just wish to find a small group of people to find out about, and you all have made it blossom to something that I could never believe. So, in particular, I want to thank people who donate to me on Patreon. You guys have been the best. Anybody who has ever donated on Patreon, thank you. Thank you for your patience, for waiting for this long schedule. I know I haven't been the best at uploading, and I want to thank you all for waiting. And I want to thank my family, my friends who continue to help egg me on with this, and everybody who I have ever interviewed or talked with in podcast environment. Thank you all. You all have done wonders for this subject. In particular, I would like to thank the top 2 colleagues of mine in the podcasting world, of Generals in Napoleon and Lafayette. We are here. These 2 have been always constantly supportive, and I wish you all the very best. In short, I want to thank you all for supporting this crazy little subject of mine on 18th century history and Frederick the Great in particular. I will leave you all with this. Be sure to go outside and touch some grass. It's important to be one with the world.